Good afternoon and warm greetings from Aspect. My name is Zaharom. I'm an academic at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and I will be moderating this inaugural webinar by Aspect. The main speaker for this webinar will be Mr. UK Menon, the CEO of Aspect. A little bit about Aspect. Aspect is made up of a group of highly qualified and respected educators and educational administrators who have been working in the education sector for many years in Malaysia and overseas. It believes in the transformative power of education. It is simply an education service provider hoping to make a difference in the education sector. It has expertise in a wide range of educational services, from the establishment of educational institutions to curriculum design and review. Aspect also provides counseling and advisory services to individuals, students, and academic staff on a wide range of issues. Today's inaugural webinar by Aspect, titled Student Role and Rights in Higher Education, concerns students' rights and role in higher education with specific reference to Malaysia. Mr. Menon, who has wide experience in education here and overseas, and is also a barrister, will be providing a wide sweep of this notion of rights and roles of students in higher education. His discussion will touch on the politics and economics of higher education with relevant examples, especially from Malaysia. Higher education in Malaysia, whether we like it or not, is facing problems, if not a full-blown crisis. It has been the case pre-COVID-19 and certainly remains the case right now as we negotiate the minefields in the wake of this pandemic. Prior to this pandemic and the political upheaval since late February this year, much work had been conducted to transform Malaysian higher education. At the core of this work has been the aim of replacing the unpopular Universities and University Colleges Act with a more progressive act that would help liberate Malaysian higher education. But as we have been informed recently by the press and other sources, this is not to be under the present regime. So what are we left with, and what are we to do? Indeed, what can we do? This afternoon's seminar aims to address the key issues and the big question of what next. A little bit of guidelines regarding this webinar. Pardon the glitches, like I said, this is an inaugural webinar that's been conducted. Please mute your microphones throughout the presentation by Mr. Menon. If you need to communicate, please write your comments down in the comment box there, that's available there. The speaker will speak for about 45 minutes to an hour. Following that, I will try to summarize the gist of his talk, get him to respond to your written comments, perhaps with some input from me, and following which the webinar will be open to Q&A, and everyone can then unmute their mics. So now, without further ado, let me present Mr. UK Menon.
Thank you very much for turning up at this seminar. This is the first time that we are holding a web-based seminar, and we hope that it will come out well at the end and that you will find it useful to spend this next 2 hours with us. Ron talked about services that we provide to the education community generally, and particularly to students and to academic staff. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been working with a number of students who have come to us for advice, and staff including, and those who have been working on their PhDs. And we found that there is a whole range of things that needs to be attended to in universities. Very often we find that university students are being taken for granted, at least in some of the cases that we have handled up to now. Student rights are not being recognized in the way they should. So those were the reasons why we started this idea of a student rights, student position seminar. And what I discovered was reading across the world and what is happening in other countries, I found that the similar concerns, especially as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, similar concerns in other countries. And I shall refer to a particular move in the United States where they're now demanding, or they are establishing, a student bill of rights. A student bill of rights which will enunciate the rights that students expect in the universities. I will refer to that. As we go along. Yeah. As I explained, the webinar was really to address some of the issues that are faced by students and even academics in our university. What was the reason for introducing it at this time? Well, I think the COVID-19 pandemic was one of the reasons why we thought that we will start this seminar at this time. As with all catastrophes, it is a time for us, I think, to reflect on what we are doing and to see how we can look at doing things differently. We also thought that, that although the rhetoric is always about education being student-centered, that rhetoric has never been translated into real action. And we thought that we needed to formulate a basis upon which we could argue that the student is truly at the center of higher education. In looking at that, I'm approaching this whole issue about students in higher education by looking at them as a social group. And as a social group, an important social group who are in transition from student position as students into adulthood. And this is an important transition. And I think it is a transition that universities do not really take into account and do not provide the kind of services that the students would expect during the transition. Apart from that, we also saw that there was a whole range of uncertainties and ambivalences in the laws regulating higher education. So sitting down and bringing them all together, I found that we could formulate some idea about where we should be going with student regulation and with the way in which higher educational institutions are being managed. As I told you, my colleagues in the US were speaking to me yesterday, and they said that their sixth Bill of Rights, which I shall talk about later, is in fact to a large extent already captured in Malaysian laws. And we will talk about how those 6 rights are captured by Malaysian laws as well. Yeah, what are we going to cover in this seminar? If you look at the slides, you will see that we would look at the higher education system, but the complexity of the higher education system only allows us to look at the private and public higher education system involving universities, and not the entire gamut of higher educational institutions that are in this country. We will next consider various theories about the student institution relationship, how that student relationship with institutions evolved over the millennium, and what are the different explanations of this relationship leading us to present-day Malaysia. And then we will look at the relationship between the university and the institution today, looking at the laws that regulate them, and see how they are in fact applied in the institutions of higher education in this country. So let us go on first to, well, I'm not going to worry about the learning outcomes. I think they must be obvious to you as we go along. Let us look first at the Malaysian higher education system. The Malaysian higher education system is probably one of the most diverse and complex systems in the world. And in fact, to an extent, I have always said that the Malaysian higher education sector, especially after the establishment of the private sector, has leapfrogged over all other sectors in this country in terms of development. We have about 150,000 foreign students in this country. We are about the ninth in the list of nations drawing students into their into their universities. So it is a system that is complex not only in its student formulation, but as well as in the system differences as well. We have in this country the British system, the American system, and we have the Australian and even the Indian and the Chinese system now as a result of the participation of some universities from those countries. So the system, as I said, is far too complex for me to explain as an introduction into this program. But what I would like to say is that the system's main divisions are public and private. And we will emphasize on the institutions that are established by two of the main legislation, the Universities and University Colleges Act, or better known by its abbreviation OCU, and the Private Higher Educational Institutions Act of 1996. Now, these two legislations actually have an enrollment of about 1,600,000 students, and half of that is in the private sector. So the private sector has made an enormous difference to the national landscape of higher education. And the higher education system itself is fairly well regulated, or is structured. The system is properly structured. I'm not going to say that the structure is always observed, or the principles affecting the structure is always observed, but the system is designed in such a way that we have an independent policy-making body. We have a minister in charge of higher education and a whole bureaucracy in the Ministry of Education that is responsible for the direction of higher education. But in his dealing with higher education, the Minister of Education, or the Minister of Higher Education, depending on what period you are in Malaysian history, is required by law to observe the policies made by the National Higher Education Council. Unfortunately, this has not happened. For the last 7 or 8 years, the National Council on Higher Education has been defunct. No appointments have been made to the council, as a result of which the policy-making processes of the system are being exercised by other institutions, by the minister himself, by the ministry, and by the Malaysian Qualification Agency, and probably other institutions as well. So the dislocation or the exclusion of the council from the system leaves the system bereft of a policy-making agency that will direct education both in the public and private sector. The second component in that is, as I said, the minister, whose powers, as I mentioned, are subject to the policies created by the council. And then you have a bureaucracy in higher education, which is also complex in many levels. The bureaucracy of higher education also is divided into private and public. The private higher education bureaucracy was established under the 96 Act, Act 555, or the Private Higher Educational Institutions Act. And the other bureaucracy on higher education, which never existed, the public education bureaucracy, until 2012, when a Director General was appointed, and you have a Director General regulating higher education on behalf of the minister. So this is, as I said, a very simplified approach. And at the independent of all of these organizations is the Malaysian Qualifications Agency. And the Malaysian Qualifications Agency plays one of the most important roles. In fact, it is like for higher education, the MQA is like the Reserve Bank, is like the National Bank. It validates your qualifications. It gives currency to the qualifications. And the role of MQA, therefore, is extremely vital to the functioning of the system. Your qualification as a student from a Malaysian university or Malaysian higher educational institution has a value because of the imprimatur or the chop that Malaysian qualifications agency places on that. So that is roughly the higher education system. As I said, I don't do enough justice to it in this short introduction. The system is worthy of examination. If any of you are interested in a PhD thesis, I think there is a subject there waiting to be explored. The two principal acts that we are going to deal with, as I mentioned earlier, are those that are shown on the screen. OKU, which some of my friends from Students Association say there is nothing wrong with OKU except the chilling effect of OKU. Well, you know, the chilling effect of OKU, as we will come and touch upon one or two aspects of the chilling effect. But we proposed a reform of the Act last year, but it would seem that the reform efforts themselves have been chilled to freezing point and will not be seen for some time. So we will look at that Act, and then we will look at the Private Higher Educational Institutions Act, which, as I mentioned earlier, is probably one of the most transformative legislation. It radically changed the landscape of higher education in this country. It came in about 15 years after the famous Merdeka University case. And when the Act was passed, the Act allowed for the establishment of private universities, and not only private universities, it also allowed for the establishment of foreign branch campuses in this country, making the higher education sector one of the most vibrant in the world and one of the most, as I said, varied systems. So those are the two legislations that I will refer to. I will not make references to the polytechnics, the community colleges. I will not make reference to some of the other institutions that are established by other laws, such as Aswara, the Fine Arts Institute, which is also a higher educational institution. Those institutions we will not refer to. Nor would we refer to teacher institutions, and there are about 24, 25 of those institutions across the country. Those two we will not be looking at. So having put this background of the legislation and the system as a start, let me show you also what are the fundamental differences between the two systems. I put a table on my notes, and I hope you can see that. Insofar as the establishment is concerned, the public universities or higher educational institutions, the public universities under OKU are established by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. In fact, only the Yang di-Pertuan Agong can authorize the establishment of a university. Under the private sector, the private higher educational institutions can be established by any company registered in the country. Now, this really is quite an important change in policy attitudes in Malaysia, because you're saying that a university can be established by individuals. You don't need the government to have a university established. What you need, however, is the approval of the Minister of Education and the approval of the Ministry of Education, and only with that approval can you go about establishing it. But something which is very seldom appreciated in this country is that private institutions are not government established. They are government approved, and they are established, in fact, by corporations in this country. At one time, even an individual could establish a university or a private higher educational institution, provided he had the approval of the minister. In terms of the types of institutions, under the public institutions under OKU, you have actually three types of institutions. You have universities, university colleges, and there's a third type, which I've not added in the table, which is a university that is established by the Agong, but it is not incorporated. And we only have one example of such a university. It is the International Islamic University. It is a university authorized by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, but it is not incorporated, and it functions now as a private company virtually. Now, the funding aspect, insofar as funding is concerned, public universities, including the Islamic University, are funded by government. In the case of the private institutions, they're mostly private organizations, enterprises, and largely financed by the fees they collect from the students. In terms of student status, there is no difference in both cases. If you're registered as a student in any of these institutions, you are regarded as a student for purposes of the law. Student discipline, again, the two statutes have identical provisions. It provides for the same safeguards on due process. It regulates the way in which disciplinary hearings are conducted, but with one difference. The appeal from the private sector, from private colleges or universities, is to the minister, whereas the appeal process in the universities goes through the university authorities to the vice chancellor. So that's the difference, but that, as I said, is one of the things we'll come back to in a while. The other important provision, again, which has not been given enough attention, is the closing down of institutions. You know, over the COVID-19 pandemic, a number of institutions have either been closed or are about to be closed. Now, what is the position of the students in these institutions when they're closed? What remedies and what recourse they have? And I will deal with that later. And what I would like to say by way of introduction is that these students virtually have no recourse, because if the institution fails, it is very often the reason for that failure is because the company has failed. And if the company has failed, the lifeblood of the institution is taken away, and there is no way in which you can obtain any kind of a recourse. For a student to become a creditor of the company in the liquidation of the company is not going to help his position very much. So those are the main differences. Let me now look at some of the theories. And I found these theories really fascinating, because there is a theme that runs through these theories, which places the student again in the center of higher education, in the center of the higher educational institution. I will use the word university in most cases because we are tracing back the history of the universitas, or the universities, going back to the 13th century. And you know, there is an account of these universities that were dotted all over, the small institutions that were dotted all over Europe, by a traveler from Arabia. And he was fascinated, and in his own words he says, it is such a wonderful thing to see that the Europeans, referring to the Italians mainly, have developed this system in which information and knowledge can be dispersed. That wonder that was before the eyes of that Arabian traveler is still probably with us, and we wonder the way in which universities actually are what you would call locations from which new knowledge is created and knowledge is dispersed. But let's go back to the university and its ancestry. The higher educational institutions, particularly the universities of our time in Malaysia, are really institutions based on that original model. Although they have been transformed, at the root or at the core, the essential DNA of that university and higher educational institution we have in this country is a DNA that was generated about 700 years ago in Europe. And how did these universities come into existence? And this is probably another fascinating story about the students' role in the development of higher educational institutions. Those of you who have been fascinated by European literature probably would have found some information about this in various writers of that period. But basically, these universitas, or the universities that we're talking about today, were really only learning collectives. They were collectives of teachers and learners. And these teachers were sought out by the learners from various countries. They would have heard about a great scholar living in in a town in, say, in Venice, and they would then find their way to Venice, look for this man, and then implore him to teach them. So this process in which the process which started off the development of the universities is a process which started with the students looking for knowledge. It's ironical that sometimes today we tend to reverse the process. We tend to think that the universities are the ones drawing the students into them, and therefore the students are beholden to the universities. But at the original time, at the original stage of the development of the universities, the students were the ones who sought out the learners. The students paid who sought out the scholars. The learners paid the scholars, and the university was born out of that idea. It went through very rapid transformation in the 13th and 14th century. Churches began to incorporate them. Local councils and town boards began to incorporate them, and they became what is known as the university corporation, which even today we still conform to that formation of the university. In the university corporation, students were essential players. They were the corporators of the university, together with the academics, together with the state officials. The students played an important role as the administrators of the universities. There's a very, very interesting story that when Ronald Reagan, former president, went into one of the universities in America, he spoke to the students at a gathering. And just as he finished his speech to the students, he told the students, okay, it was very nice meeting you students. I'm now going to see the university officials. At which point, one of the students raised his hand, stood up and said, Mr. President, this is the university. The students are the university. So the notion that the students are the university is actually a notion that was born in the early days of the formation of the university. The university's essential character was the character of the students who desired to learn. And this model continues into modern times, with modifications. I mean, and as I said, again, I keep saying this to some of my other younger colleagues and people, young students, if you're looking at a new research project, look at the history of universities from the Malaysian perspective. And you'll find that the model that was born in the 13th century is still the model in Oxford University, for example. It is the model in Cambridge University, in Paris University, in Bologna, and many of the other ancient universities still retain that. When the university is incorporated, the students were part of the corporators. They were an essential ingredient in the university. This continues even with new universities that are established by legislation, by acts of parliament. Many of the new universities that are created in the UK, for example, incorporate the university with the students as part of the university. And that's a process that continues. And I was looking at the establishment of new universities in India. The University of Pondicherry, which was established a few years ago, also is formed in the same basis. It's like Asians wearing suits to a function. We still wear the old traditions that originated in the 13th century. Now, coming closer to home, the University of Malaya, when it was first formed by legislation under the University of Malaya Act 1951, I think, the university was incorporated with the students as part of the incorporators, following the ancient tradition. But that model was rejected when the Universities and University Colleges Act was formed, and they rejected the model, and a new model of establishing universities were created by ORCU. And under the new model, only the Chancellor, the Vice Chancellor, the Board, and the Senate constitute the university. These are the four institutions that are incorporated to form the university. Students do not form part of the university. The Private Higher Educational Institutions Act, as I said, is created by a company, and unless the company is set up by students, that company that establishes the university has no special role for students in that. So what has happened to the students in this country? If they had begun in the history of universities, they had begun as incorporators, people who established the university, where are they now? Have they disappeared? What is the position of the universities? University students have now been assigned to a new position. Their position has been relegated to that as actually, as we shall see later, as contracting parties. They are outsiders to the university. That when they are brought into the university, their status changes, and you find the special laws apply to them, but they're not part of the university. It'll be my argument at the end of this presentation that it is time that we brought back the students into the university as participants at all levels of the university, at the board, in the Senate, at various departmental levels, and areas where student interests are affected, and for there to be direct consultation with student bodies whenever decisions are made about student interests. That will be my conclusion, which I'll drive to. But I will lead you to that, and I hope you will find some support in this theory, or rather in this approach that I'm taking. The second theory that we're looking at, we looked at the students as being part of the university and being an essential component or constituent of the university. From there, you move to the next stage, or rather the next theory, and you find this vast difference in the loco parentis theory. In loco parentis means in the position of parents. Now, this was a theory that was applied in the 19th and 20th centuries, in the 19th century and the early 20th centuries, right up to about 1960, when I was a student. The theory says that the university or the college stands in the position of a parent to the students who are there. They are in that parental position. The universities were given almost unlimited powers, as the courts in America said, to determine on the moral principles on which the students will be guided. In applying this, the university, the courts denied university students any rights they may have had under the Constitution. In fact, in one case, the judge went so far as to say, when a student enters through the gates of the university, he leaves behind his constitutional rights. Again, you'll find, the traces of all of these things come back, and there are birds of the same feather roosting in our trees and in our institutions, as I shall explain in a while. But what was about the theory was, we know best, you obey us, and this is good for you. We stand as your parents. And the courts have said, we will not interfere in a family life, we will not interfere with the rights of a father, and so will we not interfere with the rights of the university. The loco parentis theory actually began to lose steam, and it was in fact completely removed by the 60s, as I said, when I was a student. And what had transpired then was that students were no longer subjects of some universities. They were on the streets. They were in demonstrations, challenging not only the university and the university's rights, they were challenging not only the rights of their own state, they were challenging the rights of the world, their rights in the world. They were talking about the wars, the needless wars that were being fought, and they were demonstrating against the whole thing. Here were a group of students who were saying, no, we're not going to be contained. We have agency, we have power, we have autonomy to participate in the processes of the world. And that is what actually pushed the in loco parentis theory away until, in fact, it's hardly applied today. Although, I would like to say that it's completely disappeared. It's not. In Malaysia, courts still use that for your primary and secondary schools, and they say that the schools stand in loco parentis to pupils in primary and secondary schools. But it has not been directly applied in the context of a university. But looking through the cases, I found this troubling view of a judge recently in a case where students were involved in a demonstration outside the university. It was really in Sogo, and the student was a participant. There was no criminal offense committed. There was no police involvement in that. But the university decided that they will charge the student under the disciplinary rules. So they brought the student into the court. The student complained that this was a violation of his constitutional right. So the court was only deciding on that issue, whether or not whether the Constitution was offended by the particular section in the university's rules. It didn't look at more in a broader area. But what the judge says about the university student is interesting, because it again reflects the paternalistic loco parentis approach to education. What does he say? In my view, matters of discipline of the student and the regulation of student behavior and conduct within and outside the university must necessarily form part of the public morality, public order or morality. A university, and this is where I'm saying the limiting part of this description. A university is where students go gain knowledge and continue their learning and training on what is right and wrong, what is legal and what is not. An educational institution may act morally in the proper and constitutional sense of the term. Hence, the restriction, if any, is reasonable and justifiable on the ground of order, of public order and morality. Now, that smacks of 1930 American judicial approach and attitude to the role and position of the universities and the way in which students were regarded. And these phrases that you must always be careful about are phrases like morality and public order. Whenever you see them, you probably see somewhere behind that a man with a thick mustache, who disposed of about 6 million people, we are told, in the name of public order and morality. You have to be careful about these phrases, because they undermine the real purpose of things. The university is not a place where you go to be disciplined. The university is a place where you go to enlarge your mind, to be liberated, to become, as I said, your transitional position takes you to a new part of society as you grow up. But this is, so you find that whilst loco parentis has not really had any kind of a foothold in Malaysia, the notion that still is retained by authorities and possibly, a section of our population is that university students must behave, they must be told what is right and wrong, and that you can't lead them to decide on these things for themselves. You're talking about 17, 18, 19, and 20 to 25-year-old young people who you say needed guidance through the university. So that's the loco parentis theory. It is an interesting concept. If you went into many of the Eastern philosophies or Eastern traditions, you will again begin to see traces of this present, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm not going to attempt to justify it in any way at all. The next theory is the contractual relationship, and this is in most people's mind the modern explanation of what the relationship between the student and the institution is. That if the student is not an incorporator, the student is not part of the university, and if the student has been relegated to the position of a stranger, then you're dealing with the university, you're dealing with the student must be on equal terms, one party to another, and contract is the one that will determine it. Now, we will examine the contractual relationship in detail later. I'm just saying, positing this at the moment as one of the theories dictating the relationship. We will examine it in a little while. But the idea of the contract is that it is freely entered into, and that parties enter into it with a freedom not to enter into it. So we find that this is the basis upon which most students deal with a university, whether you're public university students or whether you're a private university student. Someone asked me the other day, but how can public university students be said to be entering into a contract? They don't pay fees, or at least they don't pay real economic fees. The fees are paid, they're funded by government. So surely you can't say that they've paid any, they've given any consideration for the contract. And the student cannot have entered into a contract with the university where all his costs are covered by the university. The answer to that is very simple. The university, the student is giving away 3 years of his life, or 4 years of his life, or 5 years. Has that no value? Certainly any court applying principles of contract will find that there is immense value given by the student in exchange for what the university promises. So the idea that because you are a public university student, you have to be mute and listen to what is said to you because the fees are paid on your behalf is not a tenable situation, not in law and not in the way you have decided to treat students. Right, I will move on to the next theory that's put forward to explain the position of students in the modern higher educational institution. Now, in this country, universities, whether public or private, are all established by law, by acts of parliament. And because they are established by acts of parliament, it is to those acts that you have to look to see what the rights of students are. My conclusion on this is whilst they're contracting partners, whilst they make a contract with the institution, these students are also subject to statutory provisions. They are, in my words, statutory subjects. Your rights are measured by your contract as defined by the acts of parliament. So this is where we will come to in a while by concluding this seminar, by examining that position of the student as a contracting party and as a student who is regulated by statute. But hold on, a very important change is taking place. If you are a contracting party, you now have the force of the consumer legislation behind you. So your contract with the university is no longer your free contract that you enter into with the university. It is not a contract that the university is free to design. It is a contract that is determined by very, very important, far-reaching consumer protection provisions. We'll come into that in a while. So students as a statutory subject is the fourth one, which leads up, as I said, into students as consumers. I can't tell you enough about this. And those of you who are involved at universities, who are teaching in universities or are students in universities, I very strongly urge you to look at the Consumer Protection Act. I very strongly urge you to go to the Consumer Tribunal to see what is being done by the tribunal. And I urge you to do this only because of this, because if you are looking for a code of laws or principles to determine the student's position in the university, it is here in the Consumer Protection Act that you will find the strongest argument to position the student in the university. The student is a consumer, and as a consumer, he has a right to be treated as a consumer and to be given all the privileges of the consumer. And that is something that, again, I'll come into later. I'm just merely showing you the different theories. The Sixth theory, and this is probably the most interesting theory, and I would, I would normally have taken much more time in explaining this, but today I will merely say that this theory sees the student not as a stranger to the educational process, not as a person outside the process, but as someone who is a co-producer of education. Or you can put it in another way, as a co-producer in the educational process. This sits in with some of the finest theories in education, which I'm not going to bore you with, so don't worry about that. But because here you find the learner gets what he wants. And the changes that are taking place now, are changes that are bringing in the university into the fold, not through the council, not through the dean's office, not through the senate, but through individual faculties. And the interesting thing about this is that you can bring about a whole new revolution in education, not by forcing a change in laws, which will take a long time, but really to have engagements with your own faculty. And if you are a faculty member, if you are a staff, to look more closely as your students as co-producers of education. I can't give you the many examples, but some of the things that have actually happened here happen as a result of the commercialization of education. That with more and more universities beginning to charge economic fees, they were looking at ways in which ordinary businesses treated their students. And when you look at the way in which ordinary businesses look at their customers, you'll find that there is a whole lot of engaging processes between the customer and the university, between the customer and the manufacturer or producer or vendor. And these exchanges or these processes, what is described very often as customer relations management, actually have gone very far. So in some companies, the consumers, the people who actually buy the product, actually play a role in designing and producing the product. Now, applying these to the university brings about very interesting dynamics. The pedagogies of education will change. The way in which you relate with the student will change. And you see, we can't use a scattergun approach in education. Shoot something, if it fits you, wear it, otherwise too bad. You're going to lose out. You can't do that. I think education must, like the commercial world, begin to pay more attention to the wearer of the apparel. What are you wearing for? And it will say, this is not simply casual advice. Actually, this is advice that institutions will be well advised to take on board, because the laws are being changed to meet this need. That what is provided as an education must fit the needs of the institution. In fact, the Consumers Act says this. Consumers Act says it is fit for the purpose, that education, like everything else, must be fit for purpose. So I keep saying these things, and we need to get back. Now, when you talk about university students or higher education students as co-producers, we think that, oh, this is too far-fetched. This is a very advanced view that is being used in Cambridge University, in universities in America, and universities which are highly endowed. But take a look at the Malaysian qualification agency's regulations. In fact, I would strongly advise everyone to get a copy of the Code of Practice for Program Accreditation, known by the short form COPPA, C-O-P-P-A, from the MQA. I think they're selling it now, if I'm not mistaken. They're on to their second version. And in the second version, as much as in the first version, if you read through what is required of an institution in order to establish the right standards for education, you will find student participation is there. No one pays much attention to it, but it is there. It is there. It is there at three different levels: at the design level of the curriculum, at the implementation level of the curriculum, and on the review of the curriculum. So if in these areas students do not play a role, then the university is not complying with the accreditation rules. When I was active in a private higher educational institution and then later in a private university, one of the things that we were constantly made aware of by our foreign partners was, have you got the report on the students' meeting on this particular subject? And unless that report is obtained, the university cannot progress to the next year. So the participation of students is not as far-fetched as some people believe, that it is not a foreign development. It is here right on our doorsteps. It's in MQA's COPA. And if we are not aware of it, it is not because it is not with us, it is because we're not paying attention to it. So that is the students as core producers. A student bill of rights. Let me get back again to this idea of a student bill of rights. This idea of a student bill of rights actually emerged a few months ago, in fact, less than 2 months ago in the US. And it was raised in the midst of the COVID restrictions in that country. They put 6 student rights that they felt must be guaranteed to students of a university. What are these 6 rights? That the students have the right to services guaranteed by tuition, which means fees, like room and board, and should be refunded when those services aren't available. This is particularly something that was affecting students as a result of the COVID shutdowns. And there are a number of class actions being brought by students in America against university to recover fees that they had paid or to get some other value from the universities for that. The second right is that they should be able to opt out for paying non-essential services. This is again a peculiarly American situation where you provide for various facilities like gyms and athletics when you don't want to do that. And at the moment, in many institutions, the students don't have that freedom to opt out. So that's, again, something which is not entirely the problem in this country. The third is that they should have access to no-cost online options for their textbooks. Now, this actually resonates with the broader question of access to education, and probably more relevant in countries like ours, where many people have access to free education, but they do not have access to free resources. Fourthly, they said they have a right to detail, and this is the point that I'm trying to come to, detailed, clear explanation of their anticipated college costs, their financial aid, and how their institutions spend tuition dollars. Now, this is really applicable to your public universities more than your private universities, that the involvement of students in this particular aspect would be a useful way to checking the expenditure allocated to public universities. If students have a role not in deciding how the money is spent, but in knowing how the money is spent, that would be useful to them. In the first right, and this goes to the heart of the education value that the universities promise. They have a right to information about how much a degree from a particular school is likely to increase their earnings. And they want that information before they enroll in universities. Now, this really puts the universities to look more closely at their products. What are you selling? What are you doing? I mean, you're not charging pittance. You're paying, students are paying big money for education. As I said, even if you're in a public university and not paying fees, the opportunity cost in 3 to 4 years in the university has a value. So what is it that you are giving me in exchange? I'm paying you this money. I'm spending 3 to 4 years with you. What am I getting? How will this increase my earning capacity? How is this being done? It's a gain and a question that if you were to raise with universities, they would dismiss it offhand as something that they're not obliged to say. And there are also, of course, the whole range of academic argument that we are not interested in the employment of our students. Education has got a different purpose. The question is, tell us that purpose. What exactly is that other purpose? What is it that you're doing that is worth this money if it is not something to improve my earning capacity? If you're saying that there is value in an education that cannot be quantified, then tell us what is that unquantifiable commodity that you are dealing with. So it's an interesting question. We will see that Malaysia already has answered it. The Malaysian laws have answered it. The Consumer Protections Act in Malaysia now says that in the case of educational services, there is a need to show that it is fit for purpose. What purpose? And how should it be fitting your purpose, which is basically what the Fifth Bill of Rights is asking. Finally, the sixth right there is that they should be able to address governing and advisory bodies for the institutions before decisions that impact on them are made. And this is a fairly reasonable request. You can't make a decision on a group of people. And as I said, the students must be regarded as a vital social group. You know, you won't make decisions that will affect a class of people, for example, and I don't mean to use this in a trivial fashion at all, say a group of people living in the jungle who are peculiar to the environment. You can't go and mow down the trees without consulting with them. In the same way, the university students also have group rights, and those group rights must be expressed before any changes are made into that. So that's what I wanted to do with the Bill of Rights, and to show you that how the Americans are thinking and how close we are to actually establishing such a bill, although not in a single document.